We've spent a little time looking at the first Americans, at those who were here before any Europeans arrived. What we need to do now is to look at the coming of Europeans, and what this did was to unite three different civilizations. The Americas for one, Europe for another, and Africa for a third, because Africa, of course, came in the form of the transatlantic slave trade. Let's begin by talking about why Europeans wanted to explore the rest of the world. Their original purpose was to develop an all-water route to East Asia. They were trading overland, using routes like the Silk Road across Asia, and using middlemen like the Turks, for example, and Italians who, carried things by ship in the Mediterranean Sea, and then they had to these goods had to be carried overland to northern and western Europe. So that made them extremely expensive. And the best example of that probably is spices. Spices were important. They made food taste better. They preserved food. They were sometimes used in medicines. And Europe at this time, in the late Middle Ages, was becoming more prosperous. Some people, certainly not all, but some people had extra money to spend, and they wanted to spend it to make their lives better, and spices was one way of doing that. There was also an enormous demand for gold and silver. Earlier, the biggest source of wealth had been land. Now there was a shift going on in which wealth was measured in terms of gold and silver. Now, 5 nations in particular led the way: Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands. Now, all of them had one thing in common. They were all bordering the Atlantic Ocean. And it was by sailing out into the Atlantic that they could perhaps begin to find a less expensive way to conduct this trade. If you travel overland, you've got to use animals. And of course, you have to pay the animals in the form of feed. You have to feed them and accept all the other expenses involved in that. You have to protect your caravans, and every time goods are passed from one middleman to another, the price goes up. If they could develop an all-water route, they could avoid all of those problems. So these Western European countries, the countries I just mentioned here, were looking for an advantage over the Italian traders and the African traders, those who carried goods across North Africa to eventually cross the Mediterranean and sell them in Europe. Now, to give you an idea of what a difference this all-water route could make, Portugal found that they could sell spices for 1/5 of the price that the Italian traders were charging and still make huge profits. This was an enormous opportunity. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about their motives, their reasons for doing this. We've already talked about the financial reason, to make a lot of money in trade. There were also religious reasons. They wanted to convert people around the world to Christianity. And a little bit later, beginning in 1517, this motive was intensified because that was the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. It was a major split within the Christian world. So it was not just Europeans trying to convert others to be Christians. It was Catholics trying to convert people to be Catholic, or Protestants trying to convert them to be Protestant. And this meant there was competition within Europe as well. They were also often at war with each other. And they were competing to gain a dominant position within the European continent. Now let's focus on the first of these explorers of the Western Hemisphere, of the Americas. The Portuguese, for one, had explored the coast of Africa, had rounded the southern tip of Africa, and gone on to India. But we're going to focus, since this is, of course, an American history, on transportation, on exploration westward. And of course, as everyone knows, the leader in this was Christopher Columbus. This is a map of his first voyage. He made 4 voyages to the Americas. In this first one here, he went down to the Canary Islands, first of all. He had 87 crewmen on 3 different ships, the Santa Maria, the Nina, and the Pinta. And then he ventured across the expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The westbound voyage took a little over a month. There are all sorts of stories about how he faced such terrible seas, and that really is not true. His own diary shows that the seas were very calm and that it was a relatively easy voyage. Now, where did he land at first? We don't know. There are all sorts of theories, and we won't go into the pros and cons of one theory versus another theory. But this is a map, at least an approximate map, of his first journey. He landed at first on an island in the Caribbean Sea, and then visited Cuba and Hispaniola, which we know as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Now, what did Columbus look like? Well, this is a picture you often see of him. So is that what he looked like? Well, how about this? Maybe this is what he looked like. No, wait. Here, this is it. This is Columbus. No, wait, no, maybe this is Columbus. Or how about this? Is that Columbus? There's the Hollywood version of Columbus. Here's the Columbus at sea, looking like he's having a difficult time. This is the hard of hearing Columbus. And here's the turbaned Columbus. What does this all amount to? That we have absolutely no idea what Columbus looked like. So why do textbooks give us pictures of Columbus when we don't know what he really looked like? And we don't, because there was no photography then, and the way people recorded images of themselves was to have their portrait painted by a painter. Columbus never did that, so we really don't know. These were all painted after his death, sometimes many, many years after his death. Now, one of the most important results of not just Columbus, but the journeys of Europeans led by the Spanish to the Caribbean Sea is that there was an enormous exchange of goods. This is known as the Colombian Exchange. Now, there were some things that the Americas sent back to the Eastern Hemisphere, Europe, Africa, Asia. For example, turkeys, corn, extremely important, tomatoes, potatoes, peanuts, pumpkins, squash, sweet potatoes, peppers, tobacco, pineapples, etc., beans. And there were other things that Europe sent to the Americas, such as onions or olives or turnips, coffee, peaches and pears, bananas, grapes, etc., sugar cane, some grains like wheat, rice, barley, oats, livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, horses. But they also, however, sent diseases. And there's a list of them here. Like smallpox was the most widespread and serious of them, but also the flu, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough. This was terribly devastating to people in the Western Hemisphere. Now, did they also send tropical diseases back to Europe? Not as much. And in class, we'll see a video on why that was true. We won't go into it right now. The two nations that led the exploration of the Atlantic were Spain and Portugal. And they sort of had the idea that they were going to be able to divide up the right to colonize the rest of the world just between the two of them. They were both Catholic countries, so they went to somebody that they both recognized as an authority, namely the Pope. And when you see the word papal, that means referring to the Pope. The papal line of demarcation was simply a line drawn around the globe, giving Spain access to one side of the line and Portugal to the other side. Now, Portugal, the year later, negotiated a change in that line so that they ended up with access to what would become Brazil. Now, this suggests that there had been some explorers that we don't know much about who had also explored the coast of Brazil. Otherwise, how would the Portuguese have known that this is the way they wanted the line to be moved? Nobody had accurate maps at the time, but this was something they came up with. They did understand the concept of longitude, and they divided up the entire non-Christian world. If there were Christian countries, they didn't get access to them, but for non-Christians, they believed they had the right to divvy it up between the two of them. Of course, over time, this certainly did not last. Now, let's fast forward more than 2 centuries after Columbus's first voyage to around 1700. And we have these 5 nations that we talked about early in this presentation, dividing up large parts of the Western Hemisphere. And here they are, color-coded. This is a map you need to be very familiar with. Now, they are creating colonies, and it's important to know what a colony is. A nation can claim or conquer land. And then when they control that land, when they control the government of it, the economy of it, and so on, the idea is that the colony, this place that they've conquered, will send raw materials to the parent country being Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, the Netherlands. They might send timber, lumber back, for example, or they might send minerals like gold or silver, or they might send simply processed agricultural goods like sugar or tobacco. They would send these back to the parent country, and then the parent country would finish goods, would produce manufactured goods using partly the raw materials they got from their colonies, and then they would ship them back to the colony to make a profit. For example, if they received lumber, they would turn that lumber into furniture and then sell the furniture back to the colony. Now, the idea was that this all existed for the economic benefit of the parent country. This was not a relationship of equality, not at all. This was a way of exploiting or taking advantage of other places around the world to benefit the European country. Now, there are 3 kinds of colonies. at least in one respect. There were slave societies, and the best example of that are Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, for example. And their main product was sugar, but also all the gold and silver that they could extract from New Spain, from their colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And this was done with slave labor. There were settler colonies. The English, for example, are the best example of that. This was an arrangement where England was overpopulated and they wanted to send some of their extra population over to places like Virginia or Maryland or South Carolina, for example. And then those settlers would grow products. They would engage in farming, things like tobacco and rice and wheat, and then much later cotton. Although that was really more a matter of what happened after America gained independence. And then finally there were trading societies. The French are the best example of this, and their most important product was furs. They would trap animals and send these furs, which were quite lucrative, quite much in demand in Europe. They would send them back to be traded in Europe. So it's important to realize that the whole motivation for this is profit. It's economic. Now, I said at the beginning that there were three different civilizations that were connected to each other by this process of exploration. One of them, of course, was the Americas. Another was Europe, but the third one was Africa. Now, we should take a look at the evolution of how labor was used and for what purposes it was used. And let's apply that to the most important product early in this period, which was sugar. Earlier, notice this ranges from the 13th to the 16th centuries. A lot of sugar was grown on islands in the Mediterranean Sea, such as Crete or Cyprus or Sicily. The labor for that sugar cultivation, a lot of it came from Slavs, think Russians, who came from through the Black Sea and to the Mediterranean. They were brought there. That's where we get the word slave from the word Slav. At this point, slavery was not primarily African, and it was not associated with skin color. But then, around the time of Columbus and immediately before and after it, sugar moved westward. And you'll notice here that there were islands off the coast of Africa that were very well suited for growing sugar. And islands are especially good for using slave labor because the slaves have no easy way to escape. And at this point, Africans are used. Now, let's move forward from this. See, here we have these areas off the coast of Africa. And that includes down here Sao Tome and Principe, which were Portuguese islands. The Canary Islands were Spanish, and so on. These circles here indicate sugar islands in which slave labor from Africa was used. Now this matters a lot because what these Europeans are doing is setting up a model, a system that they would then carry with them across the Atlantic. Now, where did these slaves came from? Well, they came from the interior of Africa. Europeans would trade with African tribes who were dominant over other African tribes, and they would set up trading posts on the coast of Africa. And you can see these numbers here are massive. 1.5 million in a number of these places, for example, over 1 million in others. This sets up a system which would easily and quickly be transported across the Atlantic Ocean. So you look at these circles here. These are the places where slaves were brought. The larger the circle, the greater the number of slaves. Now this may surprise you, but the area that became the United States was not the biggest destination for slaves. The biggest was Brazil and also the Caribbean. But we know that the United States had almost 4 million slaves by the eve of the Civil War. So why were they able to get away with bringing fewer slaves over? Because life expectancy was better and they could reproduce. In these Caribbean islands, they were brought over in huge numbers, but usually they would die rather quickly. Now, how did we know that they knew what was going on? Because they brought mostly men. If you think that slaves will reproduce, you will bring both men and women. So the whole idea here is that they would bring large numbers of slaves to the areas where they would be fed badly, treated horribly, and they would be used as sacrificial labor. They would die, and the European colonizers knew very well that most of them would die. And we know that again because they brought almost entirely men. Okay, so all of these 5 countries that we began this presentation by discussing were involved in the slave trade. These are all sugar islands in the Caribbean. That was the dominant product.